Well, we're going to go ahead and get started now. I want to welcome you to the Pulliam Center for Contemporary Media and to hear our invited speaker, Lisa Frazier Page. I just want to say a few words before we get going, which is that this is part of a speaker series that we have at the Pulliam Center and through Media Fellows. And we like to bring people with a lot of different experiences, a lot of different backgrounds here. And this semester, we've really been focusing on journalism, considered kind of broadly, and so Lisa fits into that agenda beautifully. I'm thankful for Miranda Spivak for calling our attention to Lisa and getting her here. So I'm going to invite Miranda to come up and do the introduction for Lisa. So Miranda Spivak.
Thanks for coming out on what in some parts of the world is a holiday, but anyway, it's nice to see everybody here. I'm Miranda Spivak. As Jonathan said, I'm the visiting Pulliam journalism professor here. I used to work at the Washington Post. I now do some work for the Center for Investigative Reporting, but Lisa and I were colleagues for at least 15 years at the Washington Post. That's where we first met. And starting out, I was her editor. At the end, she was my editor, which often happens there. And Lisa and I worked together initially in a community called Prince George's County, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. It is a majority-minority community. And we, I think, used to think of Prince George's as a way to be really out in the real world compared to the rest of Washington. And it just had all the issues that, as a journalist, you would want to see. Mediocre schools, high crime, I mean, you name it, we had it to write about. And Lisa wrote a column for the first time. She had covered the public school system there, which was coming out of a desegregation order from the Justice Department, and was writing about the emergence of the new school system, about white flight, about all the kinds of issues that were actually now, I think, have occurred all over the country and in many ways are still asking for resolution. Then she wrote a column which was called Inside Prince George's, which was really a wonderful sort of series of human interest profiles that she did, and is one of her many skills is to be a profile writer, and that is a real skill, I think, in journalism, especially to get people to tell you things about themselves that they want you to know, but they're not sure that should appear in print. And Lisa was very deft at getting people to talk. She is a graduate of Dillard University in New Orleans, and then got her master's degree at Northwestern, just up the road, that little college up there where they teach journalism. And she did many other things at the Post too, and then also began. She did a rotation in the style section, which I don't know if you've ever seen the Post, but it has this really interesting, sophisticated features section called the style section. And Lisa, watching television one day, found out about 3 African-American doctors who had come from absolutely nothing in Newark, New Jersey, and had become physicians. And she thought, wow, that's an amazing story. She tracked them down. No experience. They had no experience dealing with the media. She got them to talk to her. That eventually led to a book called The Pact, which is still in print, and was just this amazing story about these 3 physicians. And that led Lisa to many other book contracts, and including one about one of the Little Rock Nine. Those of you who are under 40, I hope you know who the Little Rock Nine are, but they integrated the Little Rock public schools in really one of the most bitter integration fights in this country, which I remember as a little kid, and it was just horrendous. But those, I think 8 of the 9 are still living, and Lisa did a book with Carlotta Walls Lanier, who was only 14 at the time, standing up to horrible people yelling at her and screaming at her, and then was it Governor Faubus who ended all public schools in Little Rock for a whole year. And these kids, everybody, the white kids went to private school, but the black kids had no school. So that was a pretty remarkable book. Anyway, I will let Lisa tell you all the rest. She's now gone to what we in journalism say is the other side. Some people say the dark side, but I think she's got really an interesting experience now. She's a communications director for a conservative Republican district attorney in St. Tammany Parish in just outside of New Orleans. Anyway, this is Lisa Frazier Page. Please welcome her, and thanks for coming.
Good evening. And thank you, Miranda, for that lovely introduction. First, I just want to thank Jonathan and Miranda for bringing me here. It's been a wonderful day. I've met some very interesting people, interesting faculty members, and some wonderful students who I'm sure will go on from here and do some amazing things. It's been great spending time with Miranda. As she told you, we worked together at the Washington Post, and she was one of my editors there. And Miranda was just very kind and patient with me as an editor, very creative, a wonderful person to talk through stories with. And I don't know if I've ever had the chance to publicly thank you, Miranda, for what you meant to me at that time. I think people can do amazing things when someone they respect really believes in them and sets the bar high. And Miranda was that for me, and I thank you for that. And I also want to thank all of you who took time out of your busy lives to come here tonight. I'm a mom of 3 teenagers, and so time is the one thing that I just never seem to have enough of it. So I don't take for granted that you took time out of your lives to come and spend a bit of it here with me, and I'm really grateful to you for that. I can hardly believe that 17 years have passed since I clicked on my television one day and saw for the first time 3 young African-American doctors with just this most incredible story to tell. They were getting a humanitarian award from Essence Magazine. At the time, it was a nationally televised show. I think Oprah Winfrey and Bill Cosby were the presenters. And they shared a little bit of these guys' story. They told how these 3 guys had grown up in the roughest parts of Newark, New Jersey. They had come from single-family homes. For the most part, their dads, their fathers were not in their lives. And 2 of them had actually done some time in a juvenile detention center. They met and became best friends in high school in their senior year. And they made a promise to each other when they met a recruiter from Seton Hall University that they were going to do the impossible. They were going to go to college together. They were going to go to medical school together. And they were going to be to each other what none of them had, and that they were going to help pull each other through. And against all odds, they actually did that. They did that. They stuck together, and all 3 of them became doctors. 2 became medical doctors, and 1 became a dentist. And so when I heard just a little clip of their story, I was mesmerized. I wanted to know how they did it. I wanted to know how they made it, because I felt that in their story was a prescription for the many African Americans, young African Americans, living in similar situations all over this country who felt trapped by their circumstances. And so I got enough information from that show to track them down. I heard one of the announcers say something about the fact that one of the doctors, Dr. Sampson Davis, who was the emergency room doctor, that he was just beginning his residency at Beth Israel Hospital in Newark, and that was enough. So I called Dr. Davis and I told him that I wanted to write about them for the Washington Post. As Miranda mentioned, at the time I was doing a fellowship in the features section. So I tracked him down. I did a story about these 3 young guys. And the next thing I knew, publishers were calling them because they wanted to turn their story into a book. And they were nervous because they were like, we're doctors, we're not writers, we don't know what to do, can you help us? And that story changed all of our lives because the book that resulted was The Pact, 3 Young Men Make a Promise and Fulfill a Dream. I worked as the writer on that book, and I did my best to try to pull their stories out of them and to answer the question that everybody wanted to know. How did they do it? How did they make it? And what I found was that there was no magic formula. There was no magic formula. These 3 young men had an incredible will to succeed. They had each other, and perhaps most important of all, every step of the way, every single step of the way, they had people and there were institutions set up to help them. They didn't do this alone. There were people like Viola Johnson, who was Dr. Jenkins' 3rd grade teacher. She was an amazing woman, just very energetic, and all of her students came from the Stella Wright housing project, which was right across the street from the school, and there were other poor neighborhoods surrounding the school, and all of the kids in her class came from these neighborhoods. But it would have come as a shock to Dr. Jenkins at that time that he was poor, because this woman, she took her children, and she called them her children. She didn't have any biological children of her own. She called her students her children. She took them on field trips to Broadway. She took them to the symphony to hear the orchestra. She made cookies with them after school. She taught them about Shakespeare. She formed a Shakespeare club. She did all the things that maybe their working mothers just didn't have the time or the resources to do. She was amazing. She was an amazing woman. There were people like Carla Dixon. She was the college administrator at Seton Hall, and she ran a program called Pre-Medical, Pre-Dental Plus, and that was the program that made college affordable for these 3 young men, college and medical school. But Carla, she had 10 slots in this program, and she selected all 3 of these guys. And she said she felt that if they were a unit, and if she knew that if she lost one of them, she was going to lose all 3. So she made it her personal business to stick with them, to keep them focused, and to make sure they succeeded. There were people like the medical school professor who loaned Dr. Hunt and Dr. Davis 4 textbooks because she knew that they couldn't afford to buy them. And this same professor one night drove in a torrential rainstorm. She knew them on a personal basis, and she drove in a torrential rainstorm to give them money for food because they had no care packages coming from home. There were people like the fellow medical student who one day in the men's restroom at the university taught Dr. Jenkins how to tie a tie, patiently stood there and taught him how to tie a tie because one of their medical school professors decided that he wanted his students to wear a tie to class one day. And Dr. Jenkins had a tie, but he had grown up in a home without a father, and no one had ever taught him how to tie one. So he sat in class nervous and embarrassed because he didn't know what to do. And a fellow student saw this and took him in the men's restroom and showed him for the first time how to tie a tie. There were people like the university administrators who, on at least 2 occasions, had valid reasons to expel Dr. Hunt because He just did some stupid things and made some stupid choices because where he came from, he was used to hustling for everything that he got. And so he didn't make good decisions when he got there. But instead of expelling him, they chose mercy. And think what you will about affirmative action, but without the pre-medical, pre-dental plus program, those three young men would not be doctors today. And one powerful illustration of the divergent paths occurred when Dr. Davis, he was not long out of medical school, and he was getting ready to start his residency at Beth Israel Hospital in Newark. It was the same hospital where he had been born, serving the same neighborhood where he had grown up. And so he was now a medical resident coming as a new doctor to this hospital. It was one of his first shifts. And the previous emergency room staff, he was an emergency room doctor, the previous staff from the night before had written all the names of the patients on a whiteboard and had written the status of those patients next to the names. And Dr. Davis looked on that whiteboard and he recognized one of the names. And the name that he recognized was a young man that he had gotten in trouble with as a teenager. You see, at 17 and a half years old, Dr. Davis went along with some friends who committed an armed robbery. And it wasn't just a regular, if there is such thing as a regular armed robbery. They robbed drug dealers. And in the process of that robbery, undercover officers jumped out and all of the teenagers were arrested. Dr. Davis ended up in a juvenile detention center for 4 weeks. And he started thinking about all the things his teachers had told him. You're too smart for this. You have a brain. You can do better. You are more. And all of a sudden, those things started making sense to him. And he decided, if I get out of this, I'm not ever coming back this way again. And he decided then that he wanted more. He wanted better for himself. But thank goodness he was 17 and a half years old because he was tried. He was still a juvenile. If it had been a few months later, he would have been an adult and his story probably would have ended very differently. Because he had a clean record, he had not been in any other trouble, he got a suspended sentence. He pleaded guilty. He got a suspended sentence. He got probation, and he got to go back to high school. The other guys who were involved in the robbery, they all had long rap sheets. They got jail time. And one of the guys was the guy whose name was on the whiteboard. And when Sampson, Dr. Davis, looked on that whiteboard and saw his old friend's name next to the status, deceased. Deceased. His friend had gotten into a gun battle and he didn't survive. So when he told me this story, it just sent chills through my spine because there was no greater illustration of what could have happened. And he grieved mightily that day in that moment because I'm sure running through his mind was the thought, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And that grace had been manifested in the generosity of so many people who every step of the way stepped up to help save his life. We are more connected than we think. Each of us has the ability, with one small act, one kind act, to change a life. So practice kindness. Practice kindness. A few years after working with the three doctors on their memoir, I was introduced to Carlotta Walls Lanier. She was the youngest member of the Little Rock Nine, and for those of you who are a little bit younger and may not know who they were the 9 high school students who on September 25th, 1957, integrated Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. This was an explosive time in U.S. history, so much so that U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower had to dispatch the U.S. military to protect these young people from the angry white mobs who on that day were screaming for the blood of these 9 teenagers. Carlotta hadn't set out to do anything heroic when she volunteered to go to Central as part of a voluntary a desegregation plan that the school system had come up with. Central was her neighborhood school. She essentially walked past Central every day to go to the school that had been designated for black children. At the time, Carlotta wanted to be a medical doctor. And Central High School was well known throughout Arkansas for its academic reputation. And it was also a beautiful school. If you've ever seen it, it still stands today, and it has a museum across the street. But it was a stunning school. It had appeared in Architectural Digest soon after it was built. So she wanted the best. Her parents had raised her to believe that she deserved the best. And so she wanted to go to the best school. And the Supreme Court by then had said, they had outlawed segregated schools. And so she wanted to be part of that. She didn't set out to do anything heroic. But the governor of Arkansas decided to side with the segregationist and basically snubbed the U.S. Supreme Court order, which had outlawed segregation or segregated schools. So President Eisenhower dispatched the military, 1,000 members of the 101st Airborne Division, not just to protect the 9 students, but also to enforce a U.S. Supreme Court order. But even with those escorts, those 9 teenagers caught hell inside Central High School. The white students kicked them, beat them, tripped them, threw them downstairs, threw rocks, threw food, ridiculed them, ostracized them. And for Carlotta, that was the beginning of a 3-year journey. Because after that first year, the governor closed all the high schools in Arkansas. And so all kids, black kids and white kids, were sent scrambling, trying to figure out how to get an education. But what few people know is that she returned. Carlotta returned for her senior year. And her home was bombed just months before she graduated. Her home was bombed. And not only that, her father, who had been an upstanding citizen, was questioned in the bombing, detained and held like a criminal, and questioned for bombing his own home while his wife and children slept inside that home. And even sadder, her across the street neighbor, who was the same age as she, who was her really good friend, ultimately was charged in that bombing and served almost 2 years in jail, in prison, before he was quietly released, and he ended up moving to Michigan. Carlotta and her family ended up leaving Little Rock after graduation, and she was so traumatized by what happened there that for nearly 40 years, she didn't talk about it. She didn't tell her neighbors in Denver where she moved who she was. She didn't even tell her children about what had happened to her in Little Rock until one day her son came home and said, "Mommy, I saw a picture of you in a history book." And she was forced to remember. And by the 50th anniversary of the Little Rock Nine, she had started to deal with what had happened to her there, and she was starting to heal some and to find peace and purpose in her life and in talking about what had happened to her there. And she wanted to share her story. And the two of us came together, and I did my best to pull her story out of her. One of the things that I remember Carlotta saying to me, and this has resonated with me throughout my life, is she said she often wondered how different her experience at Central would have been if more people had taken a stand for justice. And she divided the students in her mind into 3 groups. The first group was the obvious group. It was made up of mostly boys, and they were the bullies who were responsible for most of the violence and the terror and the threats at the school. They were a small group, but very visible and very vocal. There was another small group, an even smaller group. She called them the brave ones, because these were the kids who were openly kind. These were the kids who basically treated the 9 students just like everybody else. And that's really all they wanted. They didn't want special treatment. They wanted to be recognized as just kids trying to get the best education they could. But then there was a third group, and that was the largest group. Most of the students at the school fell into this group, and she called them the silent ones. The silent ones. They didn't cause any trouble, but they chose not to see any trouble either. They rendered the 9 invisible. And to Carlotta, that was just as painful. Why? Because together they had the power. They had the power to change things for her, but they chose not to see. They chose to be silent. And I think that in that group is a lesson for all of us. There's a lesson there for all of us, that silence in the face of another's suffering is not neutral. Silence in the face of another's suffering is not neutral. I've learned so much about humanity from the authors whose stories I've been blessed to help share. Another of those people is Dr. Howard Fuller. He was the former superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools, controversial figure. He is now perhaps the most visible African American advocate in the school choice movement. But in the 1960s, Howard became a community activist, and he was organizing poor people in North Carolina to do something they had never done before, and that was to stand up for themselves. North Carolina at the time had a very innovative anti-poverty program, and Howard was hired to run one of those programs, to operate that program. And at the same time, about the same time, the Black Power movement was gaining steam. And so he became one of its most vocal advocates. And he became a hated leader throughout North Carolina because he was standing up for poor people and organizing them to stand up for themselves. And this is part of the story that we tell in his memoir called No Struggle, No Progress, A Warrior's Life from Black Power to Education Reform. The book shares in detail the circuitous route from his Black Power days to Milwaukee Public Schools superintendent to school choice advocate. And now the interesting thing is that in the choice movement, Dr. Fuller now finds himself closely aligned with mostly Republicans in the battle over whether public funds should be used to finance charter schools and vouchers for poor children to attend private schools. Some have accused him of selling out. But he argues that while his strategies and tactics have changed over the years, his mission has not, that he's still fighting to defend poor children. And he believes that school vouchers help to even the playing field for poor parents by giving them access to education choice, the kind of access that families with means already have. Now, that is a debate for a whole nother day, whether vouchers and school choice, whether or not that's a good thing. That's another debate that we're not going to have here today. But one of the things that stands out about Dr. Fuller to me is that he strongly believes in the value of protest. As a matter of fact, the title of our book was taken from a quote by the great Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its mighty waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. And I can't help but think about that quote right now as I think about this moment of struggle in our nation's history, when our country seems more divided racially and politically than ever before. And nothing is more evident of that division than the way Americans feel about what's going on in the NFL with the protests, with the players who are protesting injustice by kneeling during the national anthem. I read a study by ESPN recently that 61% of white Americans disapprove of the players' protests, while 72% of African Americans approve. How do we bridge that great divide? And sometimes when I think about it, it saddens me and it frustrates me because I don't know where we begin. But I tell you this, I saw another study recently in the wake of President Trump's comments that the protesting players should be fired. And the new study was by the Cato Institute, and it shows that 61% of Americans disagree that the players should lose their jobs over the protests. And I have to say that gave me hope. That gave me hope. I found hope in our division, because one of the values that sets the United States of America apart in the world is that we can disagree with each other. We can disagree with our government without the fear of losing our lives or our livelihood. What sets America apart is freedom. We can disagree over whether we think a protest is appropriate. We can disagree over whether we like Barack Obama as a president or Donald Trump as a president. But in our division, we can rally around the one thing that unites us, and that's freedom. That's freedom. We as Americans should fiercely protect our freedom. That's what makes us us. That's what makes the United States of America the United States of America. So we should fiercely protect our freedom, free speech, free press, freedom of religion, and all the freedoms that we are guaranteed in the Constitution. And make no mistake about it, that is what's at stake when we hear powerful leaders talking about punishing Americans for doing something that is their right, whether or not we agree with the protest. This is America. We are indeed in a critical moment of struggle in this country. And I see it as a moment of struggle where we define who we are as Americans, what we value, and who is going to speak for the majority of us. But struggle can make us better. When we think about our history, especially the racial history in this country, very little progress in this country has ever been achieved without struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. We can't have the crops without plowing up the ground. And with rain comes thunder and lightning. And with the ocean comes its mighty, mighty roar. So roar. Roar. That's it. Thank you. So I want to take a little bit of time to answer any questions that you might have. Whatever you want, shoot. Are there any questions? You're a mighty quiet bunch. Yes.
This is kind of a particular question about Little Rock High School, which I had the opportunity to visit about a year ago. I'm Bruce Steinberg, Department of Political Science. The 1,000 troops that went there to shepherd the Little Rock 9 in,
Yes.
and then you told about the violence inside, which I was vaguely aware of. But I'm wondering then, did the troops disappear? Was there no protection afforded to the Little Rock 9 in the subsequent months and years?
Well, actually, there was, for the whole year, each of the students had an escort. Initially, it started out as the 101st Airborne, and then the police force was federalized. The president federalized the police force, and then it was police officers. But even with the police officers, the things that were done were sneaky. The officers would escort the students to class, but the students would sit in class with the other students. For example, with Carlotta, while she was walking, she said there was always this particular student who would walk so close to her that she walked on her heels until her heels bled. Sometimes they'd be walking along and a tomato would come flying from the second floor. So it was those kinds of things. And while the officers walked to protect them, they weren't really authorized to do anything. They didn't arrest any students. They handled it as a disciplinary matter at the school. When we were working on the book, I went to the archives, the archives of the school, and I found tons and tons of disciplinary reports of that sort, where every day something was happening to one of those students, despite the fact that they were escorted to class. Yes.
My name is Ann Newton, and I'm a social worker locally. I have the sense that the kind of things that happen to African Americans now are a different quality than what happened in Little Rock or what happened in other places. It's much more subtle than it was then. Do you have that sense, or am I wrong about that?
Well, yes and no, because the society has obviously changed. Mm-hmm. The racial issues have changed. Mm-hmm. Some of it is subtle, more subtle. Some of it is not. If you think about the police brutality, that's not very subtle. But, the schools, when you look at the makeup of the schools, they are resegregated. For the most part. Some of the issues that we're dealing with now are just, intractable. Poverty poverty and race. The issues are just sort of intermingled. So it's harder to figure out some of these issues and to figure out how to help. And it can feel sometimes overwhelming. But I'm just of the belief that there is something all of us can do. I mean, just the little things. But yes and no. I mean, some of the issues are subtle and some of the issues are not. What we're seeing now, whatever has created the environment that we're in now, but it just seems that racism, I don't know if it's on the rise or that it's more visible now. People are feeling more free to speak out in very racist terms. And we're seeing that. And I think I live in Louisiana. Probably 99.9% of the people that I work with, that I interact with, voted for Trump. And I'm not one of those people who think that all Trump voters were racist. I don't believe that because I interact with people who are good, decent people. But I think that in the absence of a voice, their voice, what is shown, what rises to the surface are the voices in Charlottesville who are walking with torches, very reminiscent of a scary past. And so it's my feeling that the silent majority is just that, silent. And I'm not talking about African Americans. I think that white people who voted for Trump, who don't believe these things, you need to speak. Because otherwise, what rises to the surface may not represent your voice.
Yeah. I grew up in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and have lived in Indiana now for 60 years. And there's a different quality here than there was there. And some of it is, I see it, my grandchildren who are biracial. And, getting stopped on the street and saying, where are all the beautiful white girls? This is my granddaughter was stopped in Bloomington and asked that. She was upset by it, but it wasn't threatening. It was demeaning, obviously. But it's a different quality than the overt hostility that I felt in Louisiana that I don't feel here. Although there's a lot of prejudice here that's amazing. I mean, Harriet was asked in class at the high school, what's it like to live in a ghetto? And, she just sort of looked around and said, well, I don't know. I've only lived in Greencastle, Indiana all my life. So, but the teacher would single her out and ask that question shows, absolute naivete or maybe hostility. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's everywhere. In some of our cities, maybe it's hidden a little bit more.
Yeah.
But racism is everywhere. And I think that we have to have some very tough conversations publicly, but also we need to have some conversations around our table. It shouldn't be okay for people to say stuff because there are no African Americans around the table. We have to have some very, very tough conversations and followed up with action. I'll just pause there. Yes.
Well, I want to thank you for your message of hope and because it's reassuring, I suppose. Resonating with your comments are comments that, in my mind, are comments that David Cameron made on this campus last year. He was one of our speakers in our UBIN series. And in trying to explain to our campus what happened in the UK and in our elections, he ascribed much of it to the rate of change, people being uncomfortable with the rate of change. And so I guess I push back a little bit on what you've said and say, how long do we have to be plowing these fields? Because it seems like we've been working at this for a very long time, and that for people to think that change coming about in terms of same-sex marriage, in terms of LGBTQ plus rights, in terms of equality of access to education and just the right to one's life, in America is taking far too long.
What's the alternative?
Well, I don't know, but I don't know what the alternative is. I mean, yes, we have to keep struggling,
that's the issue,
but is it like, was Obama's election then like jumping the shark or something in terms of that rate of change? Like, I mean, we're always going to have to struggle for what we believe in, right, and what we believe is right. But when it seems like it turns out that there's actually a very small vocal minority that's keeping the majority down. I don't know. I'm just fresh. I guess I'm just expressing my own frustration at this, right? But that when you have a politician like David Cameron saying, "Got to slow down," right? The rate of change is too fast. Well, I don't want to tell my,
I don't think
friends
that's
that
what
they
I
have to
said.
slow-
If
no,
you
I don't. I
interpret
know.
that.
No, I don't. I'm just. I guess I'm asking you, right? Like, how do you stop? How do you keep yourself from getting tired of plowing the field? I guess that's what I'm asking.
I don't know. I don't have.
I mean, and I do want to thank you for the message of hope, because I think that's important, especially right now.
All I can say is that, what is the alternative if we give up the fight? What is the alternative? We just have to keep at it. And I think that for many of us, we just have not found our voice. And I think that there is just a vocal minority. And what I'm saying is that more of us who have been silent need to find ways to make our voices known and to have the tough conversations and to keep fighting for what it is we want. I don't have any magic answers. I really don't. I'm just telling you what I see and trying to say that we can't give up and that we can't allow, if what we're seeing is not who we are, is not representing who we are, then we have to step up. We have to speak out. If, the Charlottesville people who are marching do not represent your voice, then who speaks for you? And I think that in some ways, white people should be asking themselves this question as well. And particularly white people who say they don't represent me. Those people don't represent my views. They don't represent how I see the world. Who speaks for you? And what are we doing about it? I don't know. I'm just one little writer, just trying to help share interesting stories and learn what I can along the way. I haven't studied any of this. I'm not a researcher. I'm one little person and one little voice. But when I can, I try to raise that voice to encourage just average, everyday people that we can make a difference. And in the stories that I've tried to tell, I've seen the difference that ordinary people can make just in individual lives. They're three very, very different stories. But all of those stories have in common that lives were changed. Lives were greatly impacted by the actions of just ordinary people who probably didn't even know the impact that they made. For example, I'll tell you this little story about the Viola Johnson. We couldn't find her. Okay, this was the third grade teacher who was George Jenkins' third grade teacher. When we did the book, we could not find her. She had moved away from Newark, and we looked everywhere. We finally did locate her, and she had no idea the impact that she had made on this kid's life. And she was the one who basically taught him to dream bigger than his circumstances. So all I'm saying is that just ordinary people, there's something we can do. Something. And she made these children dream. And at the end of the day, it was George Jenkins, Dr. Jenkins, who persuaded his other friends we can do this. Let's go and try to go to college and become doctors. He was the one. So in essence, what she did not only impacted his life, but the two of theirs as well. So I know I'm far off base from your original question. I don't have any magic answers. I just want to inspire us to do what we can, when we can, to fight, to speak, to help, to speak up when we see injustice, to not allow it to be okay when we hear racist comments. We hear them. We have family. It's not okay. And I think that we need to stop allowing it to be okay. So anyway, that was a long answer, but that's all I got.
Clarissa Peterson, Political Science and Africana Studies. Excuse me. So it seems like you're saying it's important for us to keep plowing the fields, right? Keep doing the work. And part of that plowing seems to be protests, demonstrations, and things like that that happen. So what do you think about two things? One, about these universities these days creating these new policies which say that demonstrations are not allowed, like our university, which says that students can't disrupt the normal function of the university. And with universities not having public statements about what to do about white supremacy, and then how to know that you see white supremacy signs and other things on your campus. What do you think about that?
That's a really tough one. I wasn't aware that that existed here at your university. But that's a tough one. I used to teach media law, and there's that. There's the issue of free speech. And at what point does free speech cross the line into being hate speech or something else? And universities and governments actually do have the authority to do what's called time, place, and manner restrictions, meaning that they can regulate where speech occurs, when it occurs, as long as it's reasonable and as long as they are not squelching the speech. So I don't know enough about what your university's policy is to know whether it falls within those time, manner, and place regulations. But I think that free speech is something that we should all we should defend. We should defend fiercely. But keep in mind, when we defend free speech, sometimes we're defending the right of people with whom we disagree to have the same access and to have the same freedom of speech. And it's messy and it's difficult to figure out when free speech crosses that line into something else. But, I don't know enough about your university's policies, but universities always were a place of protest, where students were allowed to protest and where a divergent opinions existed and where debates occur. I thought that was the whole purpose of universities and education. So I don't have an answer for you, but I do know it's not an easy question, because, where does free speech cross that line into hateful speech, and how do we decide? How do we decide if we well, I'll just leave it there. But I do think it's something that's worth fighting for. I do think that it's worth having a conversation. And that's it.
And the public statements about white supremacy and things like that.
What about it?
Do you think that universities have an obligation, a duty, to inform us about what white supremacy looks like, what signs look like, and how to respond when we see these things appearing on our campus?
I don't know if they have an obligation to do that. I think in some cases it's probably a good thing to do. I'm not sure, what you're saying in terms of what your expectation is, like how to respond. I'm not sure I'm following you. What is it that you would expect?
I would expect to at least know, if I'm looking at a white supremacy sign in the back of that wall, that is indeed a white supremacy sign. And that as a result, where do I go? Who do I let know that this happens? What as a university can I do to make sure that marginalized groups are not then caught by themselves late at night somewhere or stumble upon a group somewhere meeting?
That just seems like a smart thing to do, for me to educate your students, your faculty, if the signs are not obvious, if it's not obvious to the students that it's a white supremacist sign. But one of the things, for example, when the three doctors went on Seton Hall University's campus, there were all kinds of support systems in place for them, because it was a totally different world for them. And so there should be people, places and groups where students who do feel marginalized on campus can find support. That just, to me, is smart business.
Emmett Riley, professor of Africana Studies. I have a question regarding the election. I'm a son of the South from the great state of Mississippi, which sits right across from Louisiana. In many ways, I think the election of Donald Trump really didn't shock black people from the South, because if you look at our state legislatures, you look at the governors that we've elected, many of them oftentimes embrace these same radical views. I would be interested in knowing your thoughts on, as a black woman from the South, your thoughts on whether this election was shocking to you, or did it mirror the politics we generally see in the South?
I was surprised. I just thought that there was just no way, he would win. I think the media missed this story. I think that the media underestimated the level of rage and anger and, yes, racism and everything else that's out there. I think that not all of it is racism. I think that there are a lot other more complex issues sort of at play, and we missed it. It was a big story, and we missed it, and many of us were surprised. I moved back home to Louisiana after 17 years of living in Washington, D.C., and it was eye-opening to me that most of the people that I work with, interact with, have good relationships with, that they were voting for Trump. And I had a very hard time trying to square what I knew about them as human beings with their politics. And to some degree, I'm still sort of having a hard time with that, because, these are people that I know. And it's a very hard conversation to have. Because it's an emotional conversation, at least for me. And I think it's a scary conversation for them, because they don't want to be perceived as racist, and in their mind, they're not racist. So I think that we make a mistake when we try to group everybody into the same box. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. I think race is a big part of it. I'm not at all saying that, race isn't. But I think that it's a very complex issue. And I think that the media is better served. That's why diversity in the media is important. You got to have a lot of people in the room who are out there listening to all groups of people, so that we're not surprised. We're not caught off guard by things like this.
Thank you for coming here today. I thought this would be a good question with your experience working for the Washington Post. So this new trend of fake news and Donald Trump calling everything that he doesn't agree with fake, and even kind of the role Facebook and social media is now playing in delivering news to people that a lot of times can't be verified, whether it's true or not. How do we move forward in educating not only the youth, but even adults on social media about media literacy and which news sources to trust?
That's a really, really, really good question, because I think that the average citizen who is not a journalist, they often get they get their news online. They find stories on Facebook, and are just not very sophisticated in understanding, what's a real news site and what isn't. And it's an extremely difficult time to be in journalism for that reason, because everybody's a journalist, in some ways. And it's hard for people to distinguish what's real and what's not. And I think fake news drastically impacted the election. There were lots of stories that were just circulating that just weren't true. And that's a huge challenge for the media. It's a huge challenge for media organizations. They should be doing, a lot more to educate people about how do you verify, whether something is fake news. Facebook itself, social media, they have some responsibility in this too, to try to stop the proliferation of fake news. But I think that it's a major problem. Because it has made people skeptical, more skeptical than ever before, I think, of the media. Part of that is because of the war that the president is having with the media. The other part of that is that people just don't believe anything. Even legitimate media, they just don't believe anything that they read. And so I think that there's a credibility problem, and it's in large part due to just this proliferation of fake news. And so it's in everybody's interest to try to figure out this issue. How do we address this? How do we educate the public? What do we do, to stop this? All it takes is a computer, basically, and some skills to send a fake news story around the globe. And that's scary when you think about how easy it is for this kind of fake news to get so much mileage. So I think the news organizations have to figure that out. News, not just the newsrooms themselves, but all of the journalistic organizations, the journalism organizations, the journalism schools. These are conversations that must be had. But it's not an easy thing. Because I think the more access we have to technology, the more this kind of thing is going to grow. Well, I thank you for listening to me. I'm just one person. I'm just one journalist. I don't have the answers, to all the issues that we're facing today. I'm one voice. I'm one writer who has tried to do what I can to bring to the surface some fascinating stories, some interesting voices to the debate, and to add my own voice in there. So I hope that I've said something that resonates some way with you this evening, and I do thank you for just listening and for engaging in this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.